I've come to Scotland, to the Ayrshire coast, to meet Sir James MacMillan, who's one of the foremost classical composers working today. He's also Catholic and Scottish, and he's welcomed me to his beautiful home. Sir James, thank you very much for this time with you.
You're very welcome. Welcome to Scotland.
Thank you. As you're a Catholic, I think we can use the word vocation and both understand what it means.
Mm-hmm.
Your vocation as a musician and later as a composer came very early in your life. Can you talk a little bit about how that journey has gone?
Yes, I think you're right to talk about it in terms of a vocation. I certainly felt the musical life was as spiritually vocational as any other kind of vocation associated with the Catholic Church. And it may seem odd to say that because I live a secular life, and certainly in the secular world that I inhabit, to talk about vocation in music can sometimes raise eyebrows. But I've certainly felt that, and I think when I speak to young composers, I insist that they might not be as conventionally religious as me, but the vocation is absolutely vital. They've got to feel that deep motivation that almost comes from somewhere else that makes them want to go forward and write music. And it's a compulsion. It could be an inner compulsion or from somewhere else, or sometimes a mixture of both that forces you on and makes it absolutely imperative that you write music and you get that music to communicate with your fellow human beings.
How old were you when you first started those intimations that this might be something that would take hold of your life in the way it did?
Well, I think for me, the life in music began on the very first day I was given an instrument, which was a little plastic recorder, and that's what happens in most British schools, certainly in the 1960s when I was given mine. And it's not the seismic moment for most British school children as it was for me, but it certainly felt like a light going on, and I could feel almost immediately within days that not just that I wanted to play this instrument and play other instruments, but I wanted to create music of my own that could be played on these instruments. So even before I had notational understanding, I was beginning to write little lists of notes down, B, A, G, F sharp and so on, and just to see how they might find them and rearrange them in a way that I liked. So for me, the initial impulse in music, the desire to play music, was almost simultaneous with the desire to write music.
You're a child of the 60s and early 70s. At that moment, popular music was at the forefront of the cultural scene with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and so on and so forth. And yet your path has been a classical path, and it hasn't been like some modern composers who veered into pop music and then came out the other. You seem to have stayed with classical music. What do you put that down to?
I think I put it down to single-mindedness on my part right from the beginning. I have, at various stages, got very interested in other kinds of music, non-classical music. I even played in a little rock band when I was a teenager. And then I got very interested in Scottish and Irish traditional music, and I sang and played with folk bands around the west of Scotland and folk clubs and pubs when I was a younger man. But the core journey has always involved an understanding of the classics, and I think that might have come from my mum and possibly her dad, my grandfather, who was a coal miner but loved music, as many of those kind of men from working class communities in Britain did. You know, they worked very hard under the ground, but they lived for music. He in particular played the euphonium. He sang in his local church choir. He loved music, and when I came along, he was delighted because he could see the spark going off in my mind. And I remember the very early early discussions I had with the likes of my grandfather and my mother were about composers. About composers that they knew, that they were able to talk to me about, that I was able to hear, that I could play. My mother had played the piano as a young girl, and I found her old piano music, Beethoven sonatas, bits of Chopin, started plodding around myself trying to make sense of it. And I developed a fascination for the great composers of the past, and it's reading about little ladybird books of composers on Haydn, Mozart, Bach, Richard Wagner. I got prematurely interested in Wagner's music, and so that was the spark that has never left me. And although I have veered from time to time into other musical interests, that has been the core. I suppose you could say it's the core through history. But even as a boy, certainly a pre-teenager, I became aware that there were people, even in this country, who were doing the same kind of thing, and that 100 miles or so, a couple of 100 miles down the road, as it were, in England, there was the likes of Benjamin Britten, who was still alive in the 1970s, and writing music that was very much part of the continuation of that tradition, and I wanted to be part of that too.
Was there something about the complexity of classical music that attracted you? Because so much popular music is 3 minutes or 4 minutes. Was there something about the scale and the scope of classical music?
I think there was something about the time scale of a sonata movement or a symphonic movement that demands a kind of obedience of listening. It's not for everyone, I know that, but when people get it, and when they realise they have to give over some of their precious time in order for the music to make its impact, then a light goes on, a real profound communication, a spiritual communication is made between the composer and the listener. And it does sometimes take a time for the arguments of music to work themselves out. They sometimes last not more than 3 minutes, 5, 10 minutes. An opera can be hours, and you've got to be ready for that, prepared for it, and as I say, to put aside the time, to sacrifice the time. It's a bit like prayer. There's an analogy there. There's not an immediate fix, not an immediate hit. The deep relationship with the mysterious other, whether it's music or indeed God, it's himself, can sometimes take not just hours but years.
You mentioned the spiritual in that. Would you say that as a young teenager that music was that your first experience of something other, the sort of spiritual? Did it take you, or were you already quite a devout Catholic by that stage?
I didn't link the two initially. Yes, I grew up in a devout Catholic household as part of a very Catholic culture, and I'm sure many of your viewers will have had similar experiences, probably a bit like Northern Ireland, is actually where a minority Catholic community sticks together, and there are profound connections between family, extended family, parish and school, and that was a living Catholicism for me. And it's a kind of Catholicism you take for granted in many ways, and it's not until later you begin to ask profound questions about what all this is about. I was aware that there was something in the Catholic experience of a searching for the sacred, a searching for the otherness of the divine, and in parallel to this, the exact same thing or something similar was going on in music. There is a search for the sacred in the arts, and there's something especially numinous and spiritual about the art of music. And even agnostics and skeptics and unbelievers who love music will use the word spiritual in relation to music, in the way that they seem to know that there's something in this journey, that music can take them to another place, which points to a deeper reality that is more than just the sum of our parts. So eventually I began to see the connection. Yes, there was indeed something analogous between my life as a Catholic and the journey involved in that, and my life as a musician.
Would it be too much of a stretch to say that there has been a kind of parallel journey in terms of your faith and then your sort of musical journey, that they're both, in the sense of vocation is that it aims in the same direction, you know? I mean, is that too much of a stretch to say that your musical vocation has led you along a spiritual path as much as any writings of the mystics or church teaching or devotional activity?
Very much so, and I think right from the beginning, although I wouldn't have been able to put it into words, there was something spiritual and numinous and life-enhancing, life-transforming about even my earliest encounters with music. And the curious thing about music in modernity and the kind of modern composers I was very interested in, still am interested in, throughout throughout the era of unbelief, as we talk about it, maybe the 20th century with all its violence and its turning away from God. Nevertheless, in music, you can trace a continual search for the sacred in the lives and in the work of the great composers. The composers I started getting interested in, whether it was Wagner or Stravinsky or Schoenberg or Olivier Messiaen, the great French Catholic composer, and all the composers who came after Shostakovich from behind the Iron Curtain, Poulenc, the great Catholic composer from France, Benjamin Britten and so on, they all had this very different route to the sacred. They were searching for something. They were searching for God in the composition of music, right at the time when the world at large, and especially the world of culture and the arts, you could say, were turning away from the religious, or at least the spiritual path. So I began to realise that there is something in the very nature of this music, especially a music like classical music that demands that kind of obedience of listening, that perhaps takes you into the realm of the divine. There's something about music that opens a window on the divine, and that can be explored not just in the study of music and the listening of music, but even in the creation of new music, which is what I want to do.
I mean, it's very interesting because when we talk about modernism in music, we don't necessarily think of the sacred, and yet by the end of the 20th century, some of the most popular composers working were extremely religious, not just in their texts, the composition, but also in their lives. Composers like Tavener and Goretzky and Arvo Pärt and these people. I mean, but this seems to fly in the face often of the cultures in which they're operating. I mean, the latter two were operating in the former Soviet Empire. Tavener came out of 1960s London and the kind of counterculture when religion was not at the forefront by any means. And yet, through music and then through popular acclaim, they're bringing to the masses these kind of very sacred texts. There's almost like a hunger amongst people. But what's your take on how this is kind of almost like a divine turning of the tables?
Well, I think the discovery of God, or the rediscovery of God, can come in surprising ways in our culture, in a way that the great guardians of our culture don't see coming. I think the great secular liberals of the 20th and 21st centuries in many ways have been mugged by history. Some of the composers that came after Shostakovich, but from behind the Iron Curtain, you've mentioned a couple of them, Goretzky from Poland, who knew the Pope John Paul II, Arvo Pärt, who's still alive, whose company I was in last year, and wrote works like Credo in Jesum Christum, and had to leave the Soviet Union because of this. There are Russians like Alfred Schnittke, who became a Catholic in the 1980s. Sofia Gubaidulina, similarly, still alive, emerged from the haze of atheistic communism and all that meant, the attempt to destroy God and the memory of God in that political culture, and yet in their very different ways, maybe not necessarily in writing liturgical music, but writing symphonic music, instrumental music, choral music for the secular world, presented a vision of God to that secular world, which has astonished the secular world. And it's the same in our society. Luckily, we didn't live through anything as bad as a Soviet totalitarianism or anything similar, but there has been a kind of turning away from God as well in our kind of liberal secular societies. And you're absolutely right. Dana Gioia, the great American poet, has written about a re-emergence of the Catholic artist, and he's talking about Catholic poets and writers, of course, in the West in recent times, and he confidently predicts that this is an area of growth in our culture, and I can certainly see that in the parallel world of music. There are composers who, whether it's from what was the Soviet Union, or indeed in our post-religious, some might even say post-secular Western societies, are searching for God again. And, you know, perhaps there's a role for the Catholic artist in these societies, because we have a deep memory, a spiritual memory of what Judeo-Christian civilization is all about, and we can bring that as a gift from history to the searchers, to the ones that don't know God yet, to the ones who are reading the Bible for the first time, to those who do not know what liturgy is. We can bring our knowledge and experience of the deep past, a past that goes right back to the figure of Christ himself, and beyond that into the Old Testament. That is a huge resource, a reservoir of shared experience that we now can give to our culture. And maybe there is a prophetic role for the Catholic artist, the Christian artist, the Catholic composer, because we have that link with the deep past. I keep a lot of my original manuscripts here in the house, and I was looking through one of the boxes the other day, and I found this little piece dedicated to my wife before we were married, on the day she was baptised and confirmed as a Catholic. Oh. And it's called "Like the Deer That Yearns." Very romantic, very schmaltzy, I suppose, but it took me back. It was back to our student days in Edinburgh. But the reason I mention it is I've just seen a wonderful deer, a little roe deer in the grounds. Wow. And it's one of the wonderful things about living out in the country, that wonderful animals like that can wander into your grounds. So I suggest we go and look for them.
Yeah, sounds good.
Follow me. Right.
This is beautiful.
Yes, and it's a very quiet place and very conducive to writing music. I get a lot of music written here, right in the heart of nature.
You lived in Glasgow for a long time.
Yes.
Do you find that now you're in this setting that does it enhance your ability to work? Does it create different work?
I would never want to make any claims that the best composers live in the countryside, or the most perfect silence can only be found in the countryside. That's not true. No. I mean, it's up to the composers themselves to find that inner silence in themselves sometimes, and so that can be done in big noisy cities, and I certainly did it for many years, many decades, and brought my very noisy children up in the middle of Glasgow.
Yes.
But there's something about here, it was just time we were ready for a big change.
Now you were talking earlier about the role of the Catholic artist as a prophetic figure, and you referenced a number of figures that had emerged from the Soviet Union and had brought a different dimension in terms of thinking to that audience. Is it too much to say that Sir James MacMillan has emerged into at the forefront of the musical scene in Britain at a time when the UK is at its most secular, its most liberal, its most, in some ways, anti-God.
When I was a younger composer, I did worry about that sort of thing. I mean, how much could I show my hand, as it were, as a Catholic composer in the very secular world of the arts? And gradually it became imperative that I had to be true to myself. And for a while I thought I would be a lonely voice, an isolated voice, but actually that is not the way it's turned out. And I've found many similar-minded people in the other arts, in societies like this, in the United States, on mainland Europe, and especially in music. Music is a numinous form. It's a spiritual art form. Even those who would claim to be agnostic, and even atheist, I've heard them say, music has this effect on me. It gets into the crevices of the soul. It can be transformative. Music changes me. Music is spiritual. And when people, even agnostics and indeed atheists, use the word spiritual, they're onto something. They might mean something different to what I would mean, but I think it points to something about the nature of the music that they love, that it is a profound force in their lives.
Does that, because if we take the composer as who has that vocation as a prophetic figure in society, does that mean then that music becomes a kind of, rather than a challenge to society, more of a meeting point, so that people of faith and no faith can experience something beyond themselves?
I think so. I think for me the world of music is a joyous place where I meet people who are very different from me, as well as fellow believers, of course. But all around the world I meet people who have this delight in music, who are compelled to come and listen to music, to give over their lives to the listening of music, knowing that music will speak profoundly and indeed transform them. Therefore, you're right, the musical forum, the concert hall, the operatic stage is a meeting place. It could be a healing place, where people can get over the things that divide them. Perhaps music is the power that our culture war needs. It needs needs the power of music to come in and dissipate that war.
I'm just wondering, because societies in the Soviet Empire, they tried to eradicate religion, and it was the first time in human history that people had tried to do that. Has there ever been a society without music?
There have been objections to music in various societies. Sometimes it's religious objections. I mean, if you speak to some of our Islamic friends, you sometimes realise that there's a profound negation of the artistic impulse, especially there is no music in Islamic prayer, for example. It's sometimes seen as blasphemous and unnecessary. And we don't need to go into Islam. We've had that experience in Christianity as well, yes, where there's been a profound anxiety about the affective nature of music, the fact that it can touch the emotions. Right. And it's not just through the churches of the Reformation. We've even had it in Catholicism and indeed in Orthodoxy as well. There's sometimes this frisson of anxiety about the power of music, and we'll always have that, and I think there's always been that. There's always been rows about music in Christendom, and maybe that's the way it's to be. It is a very powerful force, but if it is harnessed for good and for truth and for the promulgation of beauty, it can be a wonderful force for our world.
Not far from here there are islands where there are Protestant sects which won't have music as part of their worship. What do you think lies behind that? Is it a sort of misunderstanding of something of the material world? Is it some sort of Gnosticism where the material is bad and this?
I think that's part of it. There is a fear of the sensual, and one of the great glories of the Catholic tradition is that they have found a place for the sensual in music, in the way that the church looks, in the way that art can be used to glorify God. For us, it's not been an either or. It's not been this kind of dichotomy between one thing and the other. That the deeply sensual, the deeply beautiful, the profoundly physical in many ways can be used in the world of the spiritual arts.
Yes.
That's one of the glories of Catholicism, I think, that we've always embraced the beauty of art and music.
You composed music for Pope Benedict's visit to Great Britain, and specifically around John Henry Newman, which is a very sort of very tactile, a saint, flesh and blood. When you were composing that, what was that sort of experience? You knew you were composing something which was to honour a holy person,
yes,
but also for such a great occasion, both state and for the church. What would go through your mind in terms of composition for that? How would you begin that process?
A number of things. First of all, he's a major figure in British Christianity. He's a great figure for musicians like me, because I knew John Henry Newman's work through the work of Edward Elgar,
yes,
the great Catholic English composer who set his Dream of Gerontius. So there is something wonderful about Newman in my life already. And when it became clear that Benedict was going to come to the United Kingdom, the Oratorians in Birmingham, who live in the same community, the same building where John Henry also lived, gave me a little relic of his body, and that lived with me as I wrote the music. The music was to be a congregational mass, so it was a tricky thing to do, because it had to be sung by the assembly, and writing music for, in this case, thousands of people to sing is quite tricky. It's one of the most difficult things a Catholic composer can do, but it did mark the occasion, and it's given me many great memories of John Henry, his beatification, the Pope's presence in Britain, and a kind of resurgence of something of the best of Roman Catholicism in the United Kingdom.
How much does, when you're embarking on something that, be it secular or not, how much does prayer, your own prayer, sort of feed into that creative process?
Well, many people have said that music is almost, and the listening to music, the openness to music is almost analogous to prayer and to contemplation. And I certainly feel that. There's something about being silent in the face of this objective other, which is something like being silent in the face of God. And I've tried to sort of complete the circle in a number of ways. I pray in the morning, I pray in the evening, I've rediscovered the Rosary. As a conductor, before I go on to conduct a concert, I always say a decade of the Rosary, just to focus not just the mind, to settle the nerves perhaps, but it's a prayer for Our Lady to intervene and be part of this musical communication. If this music moves my heart in the way that it does, let me be the bearer of that to the listeners. Can I convey something of the wonder of that music in what I do in this performance that can touch them in the way that this music touches me?
Would you see your work, your composing, as a prayer?
I do actually, yes, and I'm quite wary about about the words I use to describe that, because I know that there are many outside my Catholic world and the Christian world who would raise an eyebrow about what on earth that means. But I think I do. The process of composition is a long, patient and silent journey, and it feels like a prayer. And perhaps the music itself, when it comes into the world through the intervention of other musicians and then it's communicated, and that communication has to be fluent, perhaps that's a prayer that envelops all of us in the process. You realise that something wonderful has happened, that you've achieved what you wanted to achieve, or more importantly, you've achieved something you didn't even imagine. And that is a magical and spiritual moment where you begin to wonder, there is something about this music which is of God.
And are you conscious of that beyond that? I mean, have you had many experiences where people are profoundly moved by the music you've composed in ways that you would never have foreseen?
Yes, I get approached by people sometimes in the wake of a performance, actually there and then, afterwards, where people come and speak to you of their most intimate experiences of listening to the music, or I receive lots of letters and communications from people who have heard the music, have been to concerts, and they write to you, and it's profoundly moving to make that connection. There's a piece of mine called Quickening, which is about fatherhood, I suppose, and it's about it's a celebration of new life as well. And I remember at the first performance at the Royal Albert Hall, there was a couple who came in quite late, just before the work happened, the work was performed, and they didn't know what it was they were listening to, but they started reading through the text, a beautiful poem by Michael Simmons Roberts, which is a love song from the father to the wife, the mother, and celebrates the life of the coming child, and even the child speaks in this. And I just saw this couple grip each other as they realised that this music, this poetry, was touching something deep in their experience. They didn't speak to me, they didn't know I was the composer, but I knew, I could see just in that tiny little intimate moment that music, poetry, art was communicating.
What have you been working on recently?
I've set music by the great American poet, I've set text by the great American poet Dana Gioia. I've set words by Hildegard of Bingen, the medieval German nun, texts in Latin, but music, words which point to a depth in Catholic tradition that I've now transformed into a big choral work, which could be almost a kind of liturgical drama, something similar to the way that Hildegard of Bingen would have imagined her text being used in the service of God, in the services, in the liturgies of the Church.
Your faith is obviously central to your work, but how much would you say Scotland or Britain has also influenced who you are as a composer today?
I think I'm very influenced by place. The power of nature, for example, in this place, but also the history of this place, both as a Scot and as a British composer, the great stories that have made this country what it is, and the great composers from the past that have made this country the musical place that it is. British composers like Edward Elgar, who is also a fellow Catholic and wrote The Dream of Gerontius that we talked about earlier. He's been a great inspiration for me. He lived in a time when it was difficult to be a Catholic in this country, and yet he produced this great masterwork, which was an affirmation of John Henry Newman, of course, and his view of the relationship with God and the soul. And so the composers from the past, even in the deep past, William Byrd, the great composer who lived at the time of of Queen Elizabeth I, and used to write music secretly for Mass.
That's right.
Music, the three-part Mass, the four-part Mass, the five-part Mass, that would be written for secret Masses that would be taken into priest holes, where if the people were caught, including Byrd himself, they would be arrested and could very possibly face death. These are the great musical and Catholic figures from the past that inspire me about being a British composer.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to your home and talking about your life as a living Catholic artist today.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome here in Scotland.
Thank you very much.